Hi, welcome to my presentation. I am Eva, an assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill. Today I'm going to talk about multi-level perspective to social media influentials, frame building, cross-crisis. So first, just for clarification, by influentials, I mean any individual or organizational actor that create and share content for others to consume. And there has been an accumulating literature in public relations, social media, crisis communication, and disaster informatics. These studies review important roles of SMIs in different ways, include to inform people, to assure people, engage, and to persuade the publics. However, two interrelated questions are still unaddressed. First, how do various social media influentials build frames across crises? So most studies right now are based on a single case with homogeneous and limited types of organizations and stakeholders. And second question, kind of related to the first one, how is the frame usage conditioned by contextual level, higher level predictors? So I try to answer these questions using a multi-level perspective. And in order to do that, first I look at the framing literature because this is the outcome variable we want to look at here. So there has been a vast literature in terms of frame building, and which suggests that frame building can be affected by different internal and external factors. And the literature reviewed two ways to categorize frame building. The first one is responsibility frames that defines episodic versus thematic frame. So episodic frame is more about a single event that occur occasionally, whereas thematic frame frames the issue as a systematic issue that is within a longer time period um, and usually can be attributed to the society as a whole. And also the mass communication literature reviewed the different kinds of topic frames, including human interest frame, consequence frame, attribution of responsibility frame, and problem solution and action frame. And then I need to consider the different levels of antecedents that predict the two types of frame usage. So I look into the crisis communication literature. So first, just for clarity, I mean crisis should include both disasters and organizational crisis because crises here are defined in a rather broad way based on Coombs study. So I explicate two key crisis level factors, including first, crisis origin, which is obviously related to SCCT, situational crisis communication theory. So for example, a crisis of an internal origin could be a Flint water crisis because this is caused by Flint, Michigan government misdeeds there. And I also look at another crisis level antecedent called organizational type. So private sector or governmental organizations might be responsible for the crisis. So this is the subject in the crisis. And then in order to understand the source level antecedents of frame usage, I consider the different types of SMIs. So the literature in source influence and opinion leadership suggests that the actor's values, characters, resources, and levels of knowledge and expertise can impact source influence. And in our context here, depending on the organization type, credibility and attractiveness of different types of SMI may differ. For example, in Flint water crisis, the Michigan government should probably not be very credible. However, the federal government might play a very important role here, right? I also consider the different communication functions. There are three types of functions I consider in the study: informational function, evaluative function, and social functions. And SMI may prefer certain frames motivated by their specific communicating functions. news media emphasize informational function, and NGOs may emphasize social functions, and they might use certain frames such as action and solution frame, or they might use thematic frame to attribute the responsibility to the society as a whole if they want to advocate for some systematic change there. So here's a summary of my research questions and hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 and 2 are related to crisis level, higher level antecedents of frame building. And research question 1, 2, hypothesis 3, 4 are related to the source level antecedents of frame building. So here's the data collection, basically based on the 2 key crisis level antecedents. I have 4 types of crisis, and I try to fill each cell of crisis type with 2 actual crises. So as you can see here, for an crisis of internal origin for private sector organizations, I have the Volkswagen emission scandal and Wells Fargo fraudulent account. So if you conduct social crisis communication, you're probably very familiar with the 2 crises. And for the non-internal origin for private sector organizations, I have Equifax data breach and Samsung Note 7 explosion. So I try to identify those crises that are impactful and actually stimulate the conversation on Twitter because I collect the tweets for my data analysis here. So time frame is the first day that the crisis was talked about on Twitter to the last day of Twitter discussion. And a combination of different keywords and hashtags were also used to capture all the relevant tweets in a certain frame. So you can look at my manuscript, table 1, for a complete list for all the time frame and the different keywords for each of the 8 crises there. So eventually I scripted about 1.4 million tweets from 8 crises using an open source tool called Point. So here I need to extract SMI's tweets from this large scale tweets, about 1.4 million. So previously I developed a valid and reliable measure to automatically extracts the different indicators of influence using Python. So basically using these different indicators, I conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, which suggests that SMI have different dimensions, including reactive outtake, such as number of shares and likes, proactive outtake, such as number of comments or positive reference, and network positioning, such as degree centrality or eigenvector centrality. So SMIs were operationalized as Twitter users who scored top 5% on either of the 3 influence aspects. So this is how I identify SMI and extract their tweets. And eventually about 98,000 tweets from SMIs were retrieved. And then for the purpose of content analysis, I randomly sampled 2,000 tweets from 468 influentials. So 2 coders achieved intercoder reliability in training, and they coded all the tweets remaining. So here is the analytical scheme. I use multi-level modeling. So source level antecedent is the level 1 predictor, and crisis level is the level 2 predictor. So following the standard procedures of MLM testing, first I specify a baseline model with no predictor so that I can calculate intra-class correlation to test the degree of clustering within crisis, and ICC just shows that I need to use MLM there because the degree of clustering is relatively present. It's not super high, but it's necessary to use MLM. And then you do a random intercept model by adding level 1, level 2 predictors, as well as control variables, such as the number of followers for the different organizations. And I have 2 dependent variables here. First one is responsibility frame. So it's binary variables. I use multi-level logistic regression and topic frames. As you can see, it has different categories. So this is why I use multi-level multinomial logistic regressions. So here are some major findings from my study. So crisis origin impacted the use of responsibility frames. So SMIs were more likely to use semantic frames in crisis of internal origin. And I also found that organization type impacted the use of human interest frame. So the human interest frame were used more in crises involving the governmental organizations. But organization type did not affect the use of the consequence frame or the attribution of responsibility frame. And then when we look at the results, we can see source level factors, the communicative functions, has significant impact on the use of both responsibility and topic frames. So just taking this finding as an example, here is the logic coefficient, but if we think in terms of the large odds, we do a little math. This means that if a tweet has an evaluative function, the odds that the tweet adopted the semantic frame would increase by 2.2 times. If a tweet has a social function, then the odds that the tweet adopted the semantic frame would decrease by 0.13 times. So now let's look at some other results regarding the types of SMIs. So as compared with other influentials, government SMIs were less likely to use semantic frames. Nonprofit SMI and individual SMI were found to more likely to use the semantic frames. So in terms of the log odds, if this tweet was posted by a nonprofit influential, then the odds that the tweet adopted the semantic frame would increase by almost 2 times. And if a tweet was posted by an ordinary individual, then the odds that the tweet adopted the semantic frame would increase by 1.45 times. And we also found that ordinary individuals did not show any preference for topic frames. So this might be related to the fact that organizations have different values and missions to fulfill, like they cannot flexibly change and choose between the different frames. However, ordinary individuals does have the freedom to do so. And all kinds of organizations were more likely to use the problem solution and action frame. This is probably not very surprising. Okay, so now let's discuss our results. There are several results I want to highlight here. First, during crisis of an internal origin, SMIs created information emphasizing responsibility attribution to the involved organization through semantic frames. For example, Flint Rising, an activist group in Flint, Michigan, connected the local water contamination issue with environmental justice and advocated for equal treatment for Flint citizens in a series of tweets. And SMIs were also more likely to use human interest as compared with problem solution and action in crisis involving the governmental organizations. So probably they use this human interest frame to emphasize the experience of survivors and to advocate donation and relief for the survivors. So this can be particularly relevant for crises involving the government organizations such as Hurricane Irma and Flint water crisis. And other interesting findings I wish to highlight here, SMIs motivated by the evaluative function use semantic frame and the attribution of responsibility frame. So they probably engage the followers by providing opinions, emphasizing the responsibility of the organization and society as a whole. This supports the opinion leadership and SMCC literature. And SMIs motivated by the social function adopted the episodic frame and human interest frame. Probably chose the two frames to highlight the human aspects in the crisis, such as the survivor stories, the solidarity of residents in a community, or crisis relief efforts. And last, SMIs that were nonprofit organizations and individuals were more likely to use semantic frames. And the organizational individuals were more likely to use the problem solution and action frame in general, while the individual influence did not demonstrate a specific preference for topic frames. So here are some implications for the study. So multi-level perspective is very useful, and we should examine more crisis level and source level antecedents. And it's very important to consider the heterogeneity of social media influence in different crises and provide more generalizable findings regarding influence gaining across crises. And also there are important practical implications of the study, as the findings can help organizations and individuals gain influence on social media by communicating the frames most relevant to social media users in a particular type of crisis. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for watching my presentation. And this is my correspondence.